Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Round the Table. We missed last week, obviously, but here we are. So I will just pull up. Let's have a look. We have got, we're in Mark chapter 7. So, and I'm just going to share my screen. And then, Edmund, if you can read from your passage, that would be great.
So where are we starting? I couldn't decide where we'd got to when I was looking at it today.
We're in chapter 7, verse 24, the Syrophoenician woman.
24, okay.
So 20 through, so if you can do 24 through 30.
Okay, yeah, I'll do that. Through to 30, okay, yeah. Next, Yeshua left that district and went off to the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon. There he found a house to stay in and wanted to remain unrecognized, but keeping hidden proved impossible. Instead, a woman whose little daughter had an unclean spirit in her came to him and fell down at his feet. The woman was a Greek, by birth a Syrophoenician, and she begged him to drive the demon out of her daughter. He said, "Let the children be fed first. It's not right to take the children's food and toss it to the pet dogs." She answered him, "That's true, sir, but even the dogs under the table eat the children's leftovers." Then he said to her, "For such an answer, you may go home. The demon has left your daughter." She went home and found the child lying on the couch, the demon gone.
There's a very interesting passage. So just to give us context, if you remember, we were, the passages before were talking about what was clean and unclean. So Jesus was debating with the Pharisees and making it very clear that he did not accept their oral interpretation of the written law as to what was clean and unclean. And so the positioning of this straight after that is quite, it's quite pertinent positioning, because obviously they would have forbidden discussion and interaction with Gentiles. But the woman's response and faith is contrasted with the unbelief of the scribes he'd just been talking to earlier in chapter 7. So this is the only time that Jesus is recorded as leaving Israel, and the context shows that he's withdrawing with the disciples to rest. So I'm going to share some of the comments from the commentator before I let Edmund loose on this, because the commentator had some interesting comments. The phrase that's translated dog is actually little dog, and they're actually admitted into the house in contrast to yard dogs or street strays. There's apparently 3 different phrases for dogs. So these are little dogs, which would have been house dogs. And the commentators, this is something that I'd not seen before, but basing Jesus' comments in the immediate context, the bread that he refers to would be the rest of the disciples. So that's the disciples have gone there to have rest and relaxation. And so the commentator says that basing Jesus' comments in the immediate context, the bread would be the rest of the disciples. The cultural background of the woman would argue against a theological, she would not have had that level of teaching of scripture. So rather than, people who had an understanding of scripture would know that Gentiles were referred to as dogs in the Old Testament, but she would not necessarily have known that because she wasn't Jewish, she was Greek. His statement can be seen as an enigmatic way of drawing out faith so as to make sure it was not magical superstition driving her request. So rather than, did she have faith in Jesus, or had she just heard he was a miracle worker? So Jesus did put a barrier in her way, but might not have been as as harsh as we might read into it. Edmund.
I like your commentators, because normally the various things you said, it wasn't this. That's what you usually hear. And yeah, that's exactly right. I love, first of all, I love the thing. He didn't want, it's always been important to me since the 70s. He wanted to do it, take them secretly, but it wasn't possible for him to be hidden. And that line has always had a very powerful resonance with me, that in the sense of, you cannot in the end hide where you are with God. It will, the Spirit of God announces itself wherever you are. If you are, walking with God, you will not be hidden. It will come. The light will show. That's always meant a lot to me, that particular thing. He could not be hidden. Jesus can't be hidden in the end. You can't hide Jesus, even if we think, well, I'm not going to say anything because it'll disturb people. It will come out. So that's just a personal thing. That line always is very potent for me. And I love this, and I can hear Jesus chuckling, because he does have a thing which Jewish students recognise, and they'd all be grinning, because there's a whole tradition in the scripture, and you hear it a lot in the Talmud, of where God is almost putting the person he's talking to into a situation to get a response for them, to get them to come back. And he likes to have this tussle. He likes to have a debate with you. And come on then, come on, what are you going to say? What are you going to say? It's a challenge to open you out. And he wants you to, in a sense, best him. And if you look at Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah, that whole debate there is one of the ones they talk about. And if you read the Talmud, there's lots of places where two rabbis might be appealing to God, let him know I'm right. No, you let him know I'm right. And so they bring their arguments, and God says, all right, he's got it right. And then the other one challenges and says, all right, he's got it right. And in the end, God laughs and says, okay, you've got what you want. He likes us to engage with him. If we've got a thing we're not quite understanding, come on then, come on, what are you going to say? Prod, prod, prod. And that's what Jesus is doing here. And that's what she engages in. And the answer's brilliant. The puppies get the food. Okay, yeah, you've won, you've got it. And that's a very Jewish set of exchanges. And I'm really pleased the commentators didn't say a lot of the things I normally read.
Yeah, I mean, it is an incredibly insightful response from the woman. I mean, that it must have been inspired by the Holy Spirit, yeah. Because even just referring to the bread as the rest of the disciples, and no, my guys are resting, we can't do this. It still is a kind of a challenge to her. So she must have had a strong faith in Jesus and who he was. And that obviously only can come from the Holy Spirit. So, but it's an incredible reply. It really is one of the smartest replies in the Bible. I just love how insightful it is. Even the puppies eat the children's crumbs. So I don't want to take their bread. I just want to take the bits that they've dropped, the bits that are spare, the bits that aren't going to, I'm not going to do anything to the children. I'm not taking their rest away from them. And Jesus didn't go. It didn't interrupt their rest. He just told her, it's done. And she went. She knew if he said it was done, it was done. And, Mark, very matter of fact, she went home and found her child lying on the bed and the demon gone. It's a lovely, lovely passage. Anybody or Edmund anymore? Or anybody any comments on this before we move on? I'm happy to stay here a while because I really love this passage.
Well, I'm absolutely convinced he was chuckling and really chuffed with her. And he knew what he was going to do all along. It was just, let's enter into this debate, you know, and he absolutely loved it. I'm absolutely convinced he's laughing.
Yeah, and it's just such a counterpoint to the scribes in the previous passage who were challenging him and debating with him and questioning him. And she comes in and she fell at his feet.
I love it on the level also that when people are desperate, you know, ordinary common sense people, the religious authorities may have problems with this, that, and the other, but you know, yeah, I hear people saying all that silly thing about people falling over and making off noises in Toronto, but I've got a problem. I'm going to go to Toronto and ask them to pray for me. You know, all the stuff that different church people might be saying. When you're desperate, you go. You don't care what anybody else is saying. She's heard about this miracle worker, and she's going to go because she's desperate. And common people, Jesus says at some point, I think it's around the time of the baptism with John and all that sort of thing, he says the ordinary people, oh no, when he's talking about it afterwards, he said the common people, they accepted what John was saying. You lot didn't, but they were the wise ones. And I love that sense that ordinary people, you don't have to be all theological. You know, you go and you talk to God and God will hear you. You don't have to have it all time, everything worked out. I love examples of ordinary people just doing stuff because they've got a need and you know.
Any other comments before we move on?
I was just, no, you commented there that it was sort of first time he'd been outside of Israel. And I'm just curious, you know, whether we think his, the news of his works and his presence, you know, did spread, you know, beyond the boundaries and the borders of Israel and into other neighboring regions.
It says that in other Gospels, very definitely.
Mm.
Transjordan is over the other side, you know, it's, and then Tyre and Sidon is up in the northwest, that is, isn't it? Yeah.
I mean, Jesus was, you know, he was making a stir from the common people right the way through to Herod Antipas, as we heard a few chapters ago. You know, he'd heard of Jesus and wondered who he was. So, you know, Jesus was doing some pretty incredible things. And so the word would have spread.
Well, obviously the woman, you know, knew of him and somehow recognized him, or somebody there recognized him and shouted, that's Jesus and his disciples nipping into that house. You know, let's muscle in on this.
I think it's more difficult for us because we're used to a certain Christians over here and non-Christians everywhere else. But in that sort of world, the idea of a wonder worker, that's very common to all the pagans, and they're not going to bother, just as Jonah's, the people on the boat with Jonah, you know, they've got their own gods, but they accept that this guy has his gods, and so they land up, after everything works out well, sacrificing to that guy's gods, because he obviously was the one in this case. And so moving across between different religious practices is very much easier for people in biblical times. It seems very odd for us to think like that, but she would know this was a wonder worker, and the fact that she's not Jewish wouldn't have as much as it would do for, say, us, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and also, Phil, it doesn't give us much background. It just says he entered a house and did not want anyone to know it. So Whose house? Somebody there in that community had a strong enough relationship with Jesus and his bunch of disciples. So it's not just one guy, it's a crowd of people. Someone in that community had a strong enough relationship with Jesus that he could just enter the house and, relax and have food. Any thoughts on that, Edmund?
Well, I mean, even that, you see, it could just be that they wandered off and they went to a local, people offered, it says, if you go to a place, ask who's worthy and turn up on their doorstep and they will provide hospitality. It's very different to our way of thinking. So you could just wander off, let's get off the territory, let's go and stay at a local, get hospitality at this particular place in this particular village. And
it's incredible, isn't it? Because there would have been a minimum of 13 of them.
Yeah.
And that's that's a lot of people to suddenly have rock up at your house and say, oh, by the way, can we, put our mats down on your floor?
One of the things that I've been digging into and realizing this great flock of people wandering about, at least 13, and very often there's more than 13 if you read carefully. And it's that we talk about, does this person have the gift of hospitality? And we're talking about, she's good at doing cakes and having coffee mornings. That's what we mean by hospitality. Whereas what the Bible means is your house open to people? Do people wander in and out? My mum, being a daughter of a vicar in a very poor parish in Leicester and in London, growing up, and she said there are always people wandering up on the vicarage door and you'd be extra people for dinner. And I suddenly thought, that's very much more towards the sort of idea that they would be used to in the Bible than we would be used to now. We wouldn't expect ladies of ill repute to be wandering in while we were hosting a very important... But he isn't bothered about that it's her. So, it's not, hey, aren't the security guys guarding the door? Because it was open and people did wander in and out. And if you're in India and you're wandering, you'll see people wandering in and out of houses, much like they do in and out of shops.
It's just such a foreign concept for us in the West, isn't it?
Yeah. So going and finding a house and thinking, we'll hang out here for a while. They may just have rocked up at the local guy and said, so can we stay a few days? Yeah, okay. We've got the places around the back. It's so alien to us that it doesn't challenge us. Whereas particularly writing about it in the book, I'm finding it really sort of exercising me and thinking...
Yeah. Well, it's true community. We talk about community, but we have such a shallow version of it.
Yeah.
Phil?
They sort of do that over here in Northern Ireland. So a lot of, still some people wouldn't lock their doors over here. And like growing up, my friends' parents would literally laugh at me if I knocked the door. So there'd be times where I'd be in their front room having some breakfast and they don't even know I'm there. And I would phone up, literally growing up, I'd phone up my brother's best mate's mum and say, is Steve there? And her response was, I actually have no idea, let me go have a look. And then she goes, oh, is there? How long have you been here for? And he'd be like, I don't know, the last 3 hours, just watching sport on Sky or something. When growing up, that was yeah, that's kind of what you did.
Well, Mum was a bit, one story she always tells with rather great delight is a feed merchant, animal feed merchant, coming to deliver some sacks of stuff at the farm. And the poor guy wandered in and there's kids everywhere and pet lambs and all sorts of things skittering about. And Mum is there with she's cooking up vegetables, and we had a small hotel-sized Rayburn. Right, and Mum is cooking on that, preparing food, and there's vegetables, and there's huge saucepans and stuff. And the guy looks and he's gazing round at various children, and there's squealing of more children outside in the garden and all sorts. And he said, are all these yours? Or that's a lot of potatoes, was his first thing. And then, are all these yours? And Mum says, oh, that one's not, and that one's not, and that one's not. And but 5 of mine are somewhere else. and we would feed whoever turned up. And it was no good grumbling that you didn't get a share of the chocolate, because the chocolate was just divided up into the number of people that were in the house. And if you weren't there, it wasn't kept for you, you know. But you couldn't really tell where we all were around the village.
Right. Let's move on to our next passage, Edmund. So that is
31 to the end.
31 to the end. So I'll just get this up.
Then he left the district of Tyre and went through Sidon to Lake Kinnereth and on to the region of the 10 towns. They brought him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment, and asked Yeshua to lay his hand on him. Taking him off alone, away from the crowd, Yeshua put his fingers into the man's ears, spat, and touched his tongue. Then looking up to heaven, he gave a deep groan and said to him, Chipetach, or Epaphra, that is, be opened. His ears were opened, his tongue was freed, and he began speaking clearly. Yeshua ordered the people to tell no one, but the more he insisted, the more zealously they spread the news. People were overcome with amazement. Everything he does well, he said. He even makes the deaf hear and the dumb speak. Can't hear you.
Sorry, there you go. Apologies. This it's interesting. The just as an aside, the commentator says that this mirrors the healing of the blind man in chapter 8 that's coming up. So this is the deaf man, and it kind of shows the opening of the ears of the disciples, and then following on in chapter 8 we have healing of the blind man, which perfectly positioned to mirror this, and is the opening of the disciples' eyes from blindness to the declaration of Jesus' messiahship. So there is some pattern here. The opening of ears for understanding, and then following on the opening of eyes for them to the revelation of who Jesus is. The only other comment he makes is that spit was regarded as an important curative force within these cultures. So we look at that and we think, oh, but actually that was not an unusual, that it wasn't an unusual thing for the spit to be used for healing purposes. Edmund.
The saliva thing was definitely in the culture, and there are other healing rabbis who would use saliva. So it wasn't the sort of one way we'd react to it. Just to add to what you were saying there, this one is very interesting. Because when I read it at the end, they said he even makes the deaf hear and the dumb speak, and there's a reason behind that this is one of those hyper astonishment episodes, and it relates to the fact that there were various things which you did not normally expect from healers or the exorcists. And they said, when the Messiah comes, some of the things he will do is that he will be able to heal lepers. I don't know why they didn't think that could be done, because that's a bit of a puzzle to me. But it's there that he will heal lepers, that he will be able to deal with the deaf and the dumb, because the normal way in which they would get rid of a demon or something was to get into conversation with the demon, ask it its name, then they had power over it. But if the person was dumb, they had no way of accessing. But they said when Messiah comes, he will be able to do that. And that's why they are absolutely overcome with amazement, because, oh, this just doesn't happen. You know, this is special. He even makes the deaf hear and the dumb speak. So this was around in the culture, that this was one of the things you might expect to be the sign of the Messiah for ordinary people. So there's that.
I mean, it's lovely. You know, the people were overwhelmed with amazement. It says in the NIV, he has done everything well, they said.
Yeah.
So, but just the overwhelmed with amazement. It's such beautiful language. Any other comments before we move on, Edmundo?
Yeah, one other little thing here, and it comes out of the fact that because I'm listening to various different people in various different places, one of the things that stands out, if you talk to people whose background is, some of the ancient churches are Aramaic speaking, well, their top scholars will argue that the New Testament was originally in Aramaic. And then you talk to some of the Messianic Jewish people who are really into Hebrew, and they will make a case to show that the New Testament was originally written in Hebrew, and they're very determined about it. But then, of course, you listen to most of the Western evangelicals, and they can show clearly that it's written in Greek. And you suddenly think, what? And it suddenly dawned on me, they're missing the point. Because what it actually is a multilingual society. Aramaic was frequently used at home in the family in Galilee, they say. Greek would be used out on the street and in the market and that sort of thing. And legal stuff would be done with Hebrew or Latin. So people were very familiar with hearing all those languages going on. And at this point, you've got Ephathra there, it says in the old King James, or Hippatach. That's Aramaic. So Jesus at times, and you know where it says Eloi, Eloi, sabachthani? Well, the Eloi, Eloi bit I just discovered, those two words, it's the Aramaic form, and then sabachthani is the Hebrew. And so it's all mixed up together. So going off down the lines of, was it originally Hebrew? Was it originally Greek? Everybody accepts that you have these things called Targums, which were free translations because everybody had different languages. So I've decided I'm not getting into all that debate. All of it was used all the time. Everybody was, do you know what I mean? And then you've got Greek-speaking Jews who didn't speak Hebrew. So they're coming from outside. You've got every mixture under the sun. So it's a completely, in my mind, irrelevant debate. It was out there in all the languages, and they used all the languages.
Yeah, one of my closest friends is Iraqi, and so his native language is obviously Arab. And you hear him on the phone to his brother or a friend, and he's chattering away in Arabic, and then there'll be an English word, and there's a lot of English words that they just throw in, and you question him. It's just like, oh well, we don't really have a suitable Arab word for that word, so we use the English one. And again, I've been in Africa with friends who've been talking in their local dialect, but when someone asks for their phone number, they tell them it in English. It's like, oh, well, our numbers are really complicated. English numbers are a lot easier to use. So there's, other cultures do use a lot of, mixture even today. They will mix in different parts. It is quite odd listening to conversations where there's bits of English and bits of other things thrown in. Right, Edmund, let's have a look at moving into chapter 8. So we'll do 1 to 10, Edmund.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, let me just pull this up.
It was during that time that another large crowd gathered and they had nothing to eat. Jesus called his disciples to him and said to them, I feel sorry for these people. They've been with me for 3 days and now they have nothing to eat. If I send them off to their homes hungry, they'll collapse on the way, and some of them have come a long distance. His disciples said to him, how can anyone find enough bread to satisfy these people in a remote place like this? How many loaves do you have? He asked them. They answered, 7. He then told the crowd to sit down on the ground, took the 7 loaves, made a barakah, broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to serve to the people. They also had a few fish. Making a barakah over them, he ordered these to be served. The people ate their fill, and the disciples took up the leftover pieces, 7 large baskets full. About 4,000 were there. After sending them away, Yeshua got into the boat with the disciples and went off to the district of Dalmanuta.
Thanks, Edmund. That's excellent. Thank you so much. So let's do that. So again, some interesting insights from the commentator. I think Edmund and I referenced this a few weeks ago when we were talking about the feeding of the 5,000, where there's 12 baskets, very different basket. So that was the little wicker basket that the Jews were famous for carrying. Every Jew had one and carried these things around in them, and they were kind of renowned for it. This is a different basket. This is a basket which is big enough to carry a man. So there were a lot more scraps this time. 12 small baskets and now 7 huge baskets. And there are several other differences between this feeding and the first, because a number of non-evangelical commentators would say that these are the same feeding, and Mark's just confused. But there are so many differences that I don't believe that stands up to much scrutiny. In the feeding of the 5,000, the people were just there, and the disciples came and said, we need to send them away because they're going to be hungry. Here, these guys had dedicated themselves to 3 days of teaching. Jesus says, they've been with me 3 days, and Jesus was the one who was concerned, not the disciples. So, quite a difference between this and the feeding of the 5,000. And it references in the feeding of the 5,000 that the 5,000 were a sheep without a shepherd. But here, these people had dedicated themselves to 3 days of teaching with Jesus. So he was their shepherd. And in the feeding of the 5,000, the commentator says there are several wilderness motifs that are used, which are absent from this mixed Jewish and Gentile group. With the 5,000, the disciples led the concern over the need for food, where here Jesus takes the lead. So there's quite a lot of differences. So Edmund, any thoughts on this passage?
Yeah, just checking something on going up a Bible here just to make sure I'm saying something right about. Yes, here we are. That's what we want. Mark 8:4. That's the one. King James plus that. Right. Oh. in this world. Sorry, I'm just... Yeah, it is the same. Thought it was, but I better check that. Where can we find find them in this a remote place like this? That again is because you don't want them wandering around where people are, where they're going to be complaining because all these people hanging out around your olive trees or your little patches of where you're growing stuff. So you're out in what you called in Greek eremos topos, isolated places. That's why it's a long way from anywhere. It says, I deliberately left the Hebrew word in here. He made a barakah, and a barakah is the blessing for the food. And now we as Christians, we bless the food, don't we? Whereas Jews always think that's very weird. I wonder because they will pray over food if they think there's something wrong with it, that Lord needs to sort it out so it's edible. But what you're actually doing when you do a blessing is you blessed are you, Lord God, King of the universe, to giving us bread from the earth over the bread, and there's one over the fish as well. So it's a blessing to God. You bless God for what he has provided, is the way, if you watch Jews doing what we call grace, that's what they're doing. They are blessing God for the provision of the food. Apart from that, also what you were saying about differences, when he's in among Jews, it's 12 baskets. When he's among non-Jews, 7 baskets. And numbers for Middle Eastern people have a much bigger resonance than they do for us. We're just talking about quantity, whereas they always have these other meanings in them. 12 always for a Jewish student will immediately resonate, means Israel, the 12 tribes, lots of 12s that connect up to Israel. 7 is always the number for the world, for the rest for mankind as a general thing, those who are not Jews. So the 7 nations driven out when the children of Israel come into, that's because they're non-Jews. You get all those sorts of resonances. So Jesus has fed, he is food for the children of Israel, but he is also food for the rest of mankind. That's the 2 feedings. So like Simon says, all this saying that it's really two accounts of the same story. No, it isn't. Jesus is saying, I'm bread for Israel, but I'm also bread for the world.
So what do you think why the different sized baskets? Why the small basket for the 12 and the large basket for the 7? Do you think there's anything relevant there?
I could come up with an answer that appeals to me, but it's just off the top of my head. There's a lot more of the 7.
Go on, yeah, do something that appeals to you, because it'll probably appeal to us as well, Edmund.
Well, it was just that, there's a lot more of the rest of the world, isn't there? So you need bigger baskets. But that's just me coming up with something off the top of your head.
It is interesting, because obviously the people who read this, many of them would understand the 12 and the 7. And they would also understand the difference in the size of the baskets that we just don't pick up. Yeah. But it is interesting, 4,000 people, but they had a lot more left over than the 5,000.
Well, it's interesting. If I was trying to think from a Jewish point of view, and of course, God is our God, and Messiah is my Messiah. And what's he doing going over there? And yes, I pick up the bit about the 7. Oh no, not even bigger baskets.
Yeah.
Just back to the point about, could they be the same event? I mean, Matthew seems, he quotes Jesus talking about referencing the 2 events separately, Matthew 16.
So does Mark. We're just going to get to that bit now.
Yeah.
So I think we can crack. We're doing well tonight. Edmund.
Yeah.
We're going to do Mark 8, 11 to 21.
All right, over the page. Yeah, let's see where we start.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's just over my page. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, I always change the word when I get to it, but perhaps I'll just read it as is. The Hebrew word, the Jewish word for disciple or disciples is talmidim. So I might leave that in instead of keep remembering it to swap it for you, all right? Okay. Talmidim, it means Talmid is a disciple. Talmidah, if you're a lass, although that is very rare turning up. But Talmidim is disciples. Now the Talmidim had forgotten to bring bread with them in the boat.
No, can you do from 11?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, back a bit. The Pharisees came and began arguing with him. They wanted him to give them a sign from heaven because they were out to trap him. With a sigh that came straight from his heart, he said, "Why does this generation want a sign? Yes, I tell you, no sign will be given to this generation." And with that, he left them, got into the boat again, and went off to the other side of the lake. Now, the Talmidim had forgotten to bring bread and had with them in the boat only one loaf. So when Yeshua said to them, "Watch out, guard yourself against the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod," they thought he'd said it because they had no bread. But aware of this, he said, "Why are you talking with each other about having no bread? Don't you see or understand yet? Have your hearts been made like stone? You've eyes, don't you see? You have ears, don't you hear? And don't you remember? When I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? 12, they answered him. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many baskets full of broken pieces did you collect? 7, they answered. He said to them, "And you still don't understand?"
Thank you, Edmund. So yeah, that's Phil. That's the equivalent you were mentioning in Matthew.
Phil Holly's trying to speak.
Phil Holly, he's trying to speak, mate.
Yeah, question for you. So, can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah, can.
So, question for you. You've mentioned a number of times that you're what commentary say for those who maybe are looking, or either myself watching now or for those watching later. Do you consult a variety of commentaries, or is there one that you're drawing from here?
I did read a number of commentaries, but we started studying Mark, but I settled on one which I found I was making the majority of my notes from.
Okay.
And it's a series that I've used extensively. It's the New International Commentary.
Okay.
So there's the New International Commentary on the Old Testament, NICOT, and there's the New International Commentary on the New Testament. And over the years, I've found them pretty much to be the best for my taste. So they have quite a lot of technical in them, but they are accessible.
Okay.
So that's the commentary that I'm predominantly using, is the New International Commentary of the New Testament of the Mark. So I am enjoying it. So the sign, quoting the commentator, "A sign is evidence of trustworthiness, not of power." So they weren't asking Jesus to prove his power, they were asking him to prove his trustworthiness. And he says, the Pharisees regarded Jesus' miracles as ambiguous actions whose meaning must be confirmed by a sign. In this context, a sign from heaven signifies a public, definitive proof that God is with him. And testing him refers to the biblical provision for testing if a prophet has been sent by God, which is in Deuteronomy 13 and 18. But Jesus references 2 Kings 6:31 when he says, "May God," which says, "May God do so and more to me if ever a sign is given to this generation." Asking for a sign represents the attempt to understand the person of Jesus within categories which were wholly inadequate to contain who he was. The call for a sign is a denial of the summons to radical faith, which is integral to the gospel. Jesus once again rejects the scribal traditions, and his departure shows that the gospel remains hidden from unbelief. That's quite a nice. This is, on the first few verses. So, Edmund, do you have any thoughts on 11 to 13? I think it is.
Right, back over the previous page. Oh yeah, right. No, I really like that, because I often struggle how to sort of get clear about a sign in my head, because you've got things like Moses saying to God at the burning bush, "What is the sign that you're going to do this?" And he says, "You'll worship me here on this mountain," which isn't quite the way we would normally think about a sign, but it fits perfectly with what you explained just there about reliability. You can take it to the bank, boom. Yeah, that, and I hadn't thought of the reference that you said about the prophet and whatnot, but it fits. It's absolute. Hadn't thought of that. That's very helpful. That's very helpful.
Yes, Phil.
You see the part where it says in verse 11 to test him. Do you know what the word test is in the Greek, and is it the same as where Jesus was led into the wilderness after his baptism? The word parazo.
Parazo, yes. It's
parazo.
The test objectively. That is endeavour, scrutinise, entice, discipline, assay, which is that, is it reliable? Examine, go about, prove, and then tempt right at the end. So it is that word.
Right.
Yeah. I don't know if I pronounced it right, but yeah. I've got a screen up with all the Greek here before, so because I was looking for a word, so I had it in.
Yeah. There you go. Edmund's answered your question. Perfect. I was still struggling to get into the interlinear. And so the leaven was a common metaphor. So yeast was a common metaphor for corruption, and describes a disposition to believe only if signs that compel faith are produced. Jesus' call is to faith and understanding apart from signs. So that's why Jesus is warning them, watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod, because they're looking for signs and proof. I'm looking for faith. Edmund?
Yeah, it's interesting that this crops up, because just a couple of days ago, a thing cropped up on a sort of site relating to the guy I get a lot of my Jewish stuff from, and someone was asking a question about leaven, the hametz it is, and I was saying that normally for Jews, leaven is a negative thing, but which is what it's being used as here. But it doesn't necessarily in Scripture. I remember when I was in Boston and I was in I went into a church, the Messianic meeting, and they were talking about the parables of the kingdom, and Jesus says it's like leaven which a woman mixed in a loaf of bread, and in some very convoluted way, because they were very used to seeing leaven as a negative, they somehow turned the parable inside out to make it a negative. And you just no, that's not right. And the thing is that a negative thing isn't always a negative. If you think about the serpent in the Old Testament, the serpent is almost always negative. But there's a time when God says, put a serpent on and that's a symbol of Jesus. And I remember John Paul Jackson talking about interpretation of dreams, and he presented us with a dream to interpret, and it had a snake in it. And the whole point of that particular dream, the test he was giving us, if you look in books on dreams, they always say the snake is a negative, serpent, evil, this, that, and the other. And in this dream, it was a positive thing. So in this case, leaven, although normally negative throughout scriptures, is not always negative. I think it is in this.
I think it is in this reference because Jesus.
Oh, it is in this. Yes, it is. It's exactly. But I just wanted to make the point because it had happened to come up, and there'd been quite a discussion over this, and trying to unwrap this so that folk would understand we don't necessarily every time we see a certain thing mean the same thing every time. So Jesus uses leaven a couple of times in a positive sense, for it's the way it will get through everything, as it were. I just thought I'd chuck that in because we've been talking about it.
Yeah, and the phrase "the exception that proves the rule."
Yeah.
So usually it's negative, but sometimes it's not. But the disciples' response, I mean, bless them. You do wonder, don't you, sometimes? How long had they been with Jesus, and intimately being taught by him, and hearing him, and he says that, and they just think, oh, it's because we forgot bread. They're caught up in the now, and they're just, I don't know. And, Jesus isn't impressed. Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? Which is how Israel was described so many times by the prophets. In a negative way, this nation, hard of heart, blind of seeing, no understanding. So Jesus has been quite, Jesus is quite tough on the disciples quite often. But you can imagine his frustration. It's like, guys, don't you remember when I brought the 5 loaves for the 5,000? How many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12. And when I brought the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 7. It's like, guys, am I really going to be talking about you've only brought 1 loaf of bread? Seriously? So, but it just shows we have to have that lesson ourselves, that we can just have our understanding, and we're not listening to God, listening to the Holy Spirit, because he's doing something and speaking something different. Any comments on that before we finish, Edmund?
Yeah, I've just brought up the Greek word for that, for harden, because when I was reading it in Matthew, actually, I'm in Matthew at the moment, I happened to read this equivalent bit, and suddenly, as I saw the harden, I was thinking about Pharaoh and Moses and how he hardened his, and someone talking about that, what they'd said about that suddenly made me, or when Jesus says about divorce, and he says that's not really the way a divorce is not really the way God originally intended it, but because of the hardness of your heart, which is the inability to accommodate bending to take the person back, that sort of idea. And so that then took me, I suddenly thought of that and thought, their inability to sort of be flexible enough. And suddenly I read it like, I mean, it works better in the other translation I was reading rather than this one, but I suddenly saw it like as if it was saying, are you so blinkered? Because when you've got blinkers on, you can only see the thing immediately in front of you. You're not able to take in context or anything like that. So it just struck me that that was a way of how I would interpret to us in our culture. They were blinkered. And looking at the Greek, it doesn't fit precisely with that. It says it's paroo, apparently from something else, a kind of stone to petrify, that is figuratively to render stupid or callous, blind, harden.
It's I'm looking at Strong's here, and it's saying it's calloused. So it's something that was soft and became hard.
Oh, well, that fits with, yeah.
And petrified is like fossilized, something that is softer but turns to stone. So it's not hard as in it's always been hard, but it's hard as in it was soft and became hard.
Oh, so that fits with the other one, doesn't it? Yeah. Yeah, it does. But I sort of like that. They're blinkered. They're not really seeing. Don't you realise? Can't you see? Can't you? You've just got these blinkers on and you need to take them off. And it struck me that very often we're blinkered in the way, tradition does that to you, gives you blinkers. It can show you very good things straight ahead. The horse can run better because it's got blinkers on in a race. So it's not that it's all bad, but it does mean that the context is often, you miss the context.
Yeah.
Which is what they've done here.
Right, guys, any final comments, questions? Great, I will stop us then.